I think, however, that we are going to have to contend with a certain rather pernicious class war element of this that's being really ratcheted up, particularly from right-wing commentators. And I think what it's doing is exploiting the fact that there is a 99%. But because most Americans are in this bolus of middle class, working class, or poor, and within that there are significant gradations, despite there being this enormous gap between the 99 and the 1%, that there are all these opportunities that are being exploited to make people feel resentments within this group that should be a coalition. And people on the right are doing a shockingly, I think, good job about it, in part because the neoliberal left that is also on the cable news cycle doesn't do anything to push back against that argument. In fact, they're all the Larry Summers, the MSNBC talking heads, and the Fox News talking heads are all in concert about how they approach this issue. So if you can just tolerate hearing this, I want to play a little bit of this clip that was pulled by a friend of the show, Case Study QB, that I think is a really perfect example of what we're up against.
President Biden extending the freeze on student loan payments until May. Meanwhile, the far left is demanding outright cancellation of student loan debts. The Wall Street Journal calling it the forever student loan emergency. Marc Thiessen is a former speechwriter to President George W. Bush, a Fox News contributor. He joins us today to break this down. Marc, thanks very much for being with us.
Love to hear from George Bush's speechwriter.
I want to get to the progressive, moderate.
He looks so happy
you
about
too.
it, too.
To the pull between the progressives and moderates in just 1 minute. But I want to get your view just on the idea of repaying student debt. It seems to me there are two key issues, which is the majority of Americans do not have four-year college degrees, so most people would be paying for that minority.
Ben? First off, it's framed explicitly as a 4-year college issue. Mm-hmm. Thoughts? I mean, my ears, my antenna.
Look. You know that every student debtor went to Harvard, just like you, Bray? Yes. I mean, 40% of people who have student debt did not graduate. They have the burden of the debt without the benefit, now what is an ambiguous benefit of having a college degree. Like, he's wrong. And the people who do go to these schools that they like to invoke, because of these wondrous endowments you mentioned, like typically don't graduate with any debt. So there's totally there's a lot of class confusion in what he's saying, and it's purposeful. I just want to say I so agree with the way you laid out the problem with the centrists and these like right-wing commentators who all did go to those fancy schools and kind of share this class background, who just refuse, for ideological reasons to make a robust defense of education as a public good and the debt cancellation that fits into that progressive democratic worldview. It is telling to me that even Larry Summers and other critics of student debt cancellation, including people who work at like the American Enterprise Institute, who are funded by ultimately what is student loan servicer money, have to make their arguments, if they are not on the right, in terms of student debt cancellation being regressive. And I think this points to us kind of, really having the moral high ground, right? They can't just say, no, we don't like it because we're, elitists. They have to twist themselves into these pretzels and saying, well, no, it's because we actually care about fairness in poor people.
Right. Yeah. All of a sudden.
And racial justice.
And I don't know if this is where it's going, but so I think the main point on this 4-year college degree thing Astra just made, which is that a lot of people don't finish their degrees and they have student debt.
Right.
But also, people who go to 2-year community colleges have student debt. People who go to vocational schools, people who go to beauty schools, people who go to all kinds of institutions have student debt.
Yeah.
For-profit colleges. Like, it's picking this one little statistic in order to try to paint the population of people with student debt as you said, like to try to play into this class resentment kind of situation. That's just not true at all, right? That's not what you, that's not who people are. That's not who we are or any of the people we talk to.
Before this segment, I put it in the Google machine, and Google told me that the average debt for an associate's degree, a 2-year degree, is $19,600, with 47% of people who get 2-year degrees taking out debt. Almost $20,000 for your average associate's degree. Mm-hmm. All right, let's continue, Ben.
So first of all, on the moratorium, this is going to fuel inflation and labor shortages because it's a disincentive to work. So if you don't have to pay your student loans at all for the next 6 months, then you are less likely to return to the workforce. And we are all paying for that because businesses can't find workers to meet demand. And so prices are going up and there's shortages. So we're all paying for this moratorium.
Get in here, Astra. Say your truth.
I'm so for disincentives to work, but I'm just like, he said the quiet part out loud,
right?
Which is that
yes,
debt is a form of coercion.
Yes,
it coerces people. People talk a lot about the future of workers and the future of work, and it's like debt is about student debt in particular is about the future of workers. It compels people to take jobs that they would not otherwise take. It compels many lawyers to go into corporate law. It compels people to. I think I know who I'm talking to. It compels people who would like to be, family practitioners to, become anesthesiologists, plastic surgeons, right? It dissuades people from becoming teachers, from pursuing their passions, or maybe working less, God forbid. So I find that absolutely hilarious and truthful. And it goes, the history of student debt is a history of suppressing student protests in the 1960s in California. And so there's always been this element of social control, and especially control of the workforce. And, I'm sorry, but education, and, we know educational policy is labor policy, right? Because they're like, we want to create certain types of workers with certain types of skills. And debt is a very violent form of that sort of policy. So I'm kind of, I guess part of me is like, yeah, right on. And not, and part of why free college is so, part of what is so appealing about free college is that it would disincentivize military recruitment, right? It would, like make college free, and you want to have people signing up to join the military so they can get a bit of student aid. So let us be his worst nightmare.
Yeah, which I think the military has actually itself pointed out before.
Really?
Has an argument against cancellation.
Might have to go find that. Well, so I think that, like, yes, that is 100% quiet part out loud, right? It's, I feel like that's something that we were saying a while ago at kind of like the most radical extreme, and people like, come on, student debt's about building human capital, and then that gives you your options in the labor market. No, it's about forcing you into the labor market. It's also just not, like, it's also kind of nonsensical in terms of the way that both the payment pause and student debt in general works, right? Because, the notion that as like a isolated borrower to borrower, I don't want to take away from this point that it does compel people into the labor market in general, but borrower to borrower, any kind of given debt, there are much better reasons that you need income than to pay a debt, right? Like, usually if somebody is not working and is not bringing in any income, like, that's a much bigger concern in itself than whatever their required debt payments are. And on top of that, student debt itself also has income-based repayment programs such that, they're tremendously deficient, they're tremendously underused, but it is also true that if you don't have any income, you can sign up for income-based repayment, and your required payments, at least for most federal debt, will be zero. And so I think it psychologically, absolutely, yes, does compel people into the labor market. But practically speaking, if you're looking at sort of like dollars and cents that matter in terms of the national economy or the federal budget or whatever the fuck you want to pretend you care about, it's not nearly that simple. So they're wrong on both fronts, morally wrong and practically wrong. I
think there are lots of capitalist pro-market arguments for debt cancellation. That's the whole point of the Levy Institute paper, right? Is that it would boost the economy, that, as Larry Summers warned, people would be buying stuff, which would overheat the economy. So it's like, so it really depends, sort of, okay, are you looking at this from the perspective of employers who want really, really vulnerable employees who have no bargaining power? Right. Or, do you want consumers, right, with who aren't sending $600,000, $800,000, $1,000 a month, to the government that doesn't really need the money.
I remember the Bush era where we were all told to do a patriotism and go shopping after 9/11. Mm-hmm. Like I seem to remember that the idea that we would sit on our little like $200 stimulus or whatever came down the transom during the Bush years was unpatriotic, and the best thing you could do is to have a little disposable income that you would immediately spent back into the economy. And I also remember a lot of rhetoric about needing to have money to start small businesses and build capital and do all this stuff and have the freedom and liberty to, not have to participate in work for somebody else. You want to be a job creator. Where did all of that go? Because I'll tell you what, the student loan moratorium allowed me to start a business.
Mm-hmm.
not having to pay those student debts. If I had to have those $2,300 a month payments last year when I was unemployed, I would have run into the arms of the first whoever who would have hired me just to, pay me a salary and give me health insurance. And that truly allowed me to go longer and assess my options, which you could argue is a net negative. There are plenty of people who would argue that we would be in a better world without Bad Faith Podcast, but those are the same people who are arguing against, universal health care, student debt forgiveness, and everything else good in the world. So I'm going to count that one as a win. Should we keep forging through?
In terms of outright forgiveness of these loans, only about 40% of Americans have four-year college educations, and most of them are white. About 60% do not go to college. So what AOC and the progressives are proposing is that working class Americans who don't go to college subsidize the educations of mostly white middle class Americans. How is that progressive?
Let's pause this.
And in addition,
I love it when the right starts doing identity politics. In some respects, it warms my heart. It's like, hey, these ID Paul focused libs have won a weird tiny victory where everyone's making the argument here, to be clear, is that because, quote unquote, most of the people who benefit from this are white, it's a bad idea, which is something that generally on Fox News, most people being white is considered to be a good thing in terms of a policy. I would remind everyone involved that in America, where 70% of the population is white, literally everything, every anti-poverty initiative, everything is going to mostly inure to white people. But that says nothing about who it disproportionately affects, etc. Any thoughts here? Let me ask you this, Astra, because a lot of the rhetoric coming from progressives and the broader left is framing student loan debt in racial terms. And I have also done this, right? In the context of the campaign, especially given the kind of critique that Bernie was getting, I understood there was a lot of value in the liberal media to be able to say this is a racial justice initiative. Bernie has this problem with Black people, allegedly. He was the only one running on full debt cancellation. Elizabeth Warren, was making her case against Bernie that she was kind of the more diverse version of him. So emphasizing the racial impacts, the disproportionate racial impacts of student loan debt felt to be at a time an advantage. How now do you feel in this context about the choice of progressives to continually frame student loan cancellation as a racial justice issue, seeing how it's being kind of manipulated in this way by conservatives?
So I think that we should talk about it as a racial justice issue because it absolutely is one. The problem is that some progressives who are leading with that element of this are kind of being misleading in the way they're framing it. So there's a coalition of people, Elizabeth Warren is the leader of it, who are pushing for $50,000 of cancellation, right?
Yeah.
And the logic behind that was that $50,000 was a number that they had come up with, was where you get the sort of maximum closing of the racial wealth gap. The people behind that research are now saying, no, we were wrong. It's 75,000 and up, right? So what kind of gets my goat about this is that it's not just this robust thing of like, it's immoral. Student debt shouldn't exist. It didn't exist for that old guy we just saw on Fox News, right? Like, believe me, he did not graduate. Believe me, he went to a four-year college. He did not graduate with student debt. And that there are all of these socially beneficial consequences. One of them is that it is a way of dramatically narrowing the racial wealth gap. Louise Seamster was on the New York Times podcast recently, and the numbers she put out there were astounding. It's that when the racial wealth gap in terms of households, typical median households is like 10 to 1. But when you just look at households with student debt, it goes to 20 to 1. Cancel student debt, 3 to 1. So this is a powerful way to narrow the racial wealth gap. But yes, it helps a whole lot of working class people of all, from all backgrounds. And also a lot of people who don't have fancy, whatever we think of as college educated degrees, because that whole idea that going to college, going to vocational school, getting your 4-year degree guaranteed you some affluent, middle class, upwardly mobile lifestyle was totally wrong, right?
Yeah.
You want good paying jobs, unionize workers, give workers power in the workplace. Don't try to tweak educational policy. So yeah, I think it's important to talk about it because it's true, but to talk about it in the fullness of the solution that it leads you to when you actually look at the data. Andre Perry at the Brookings Institute just put out a great study, where it said when you look at wealth and not income, the arguments, if you care about racial justice, it's like cancel it all. Cancel. The more you cancel, the better it is. So when you actually take those arguments seriously, they lead you to quote unquote radical solutions, not these half measures, and certainly not, that guy's, bullshit commentary on Fox News, and also not this like, oh, cancellation is actually regressive. I work for the American Enterprise Institute. And I care, because to this we go like, oh, really? How about we go to college for free, all of us, we make whatever money we can, and then we have a really, really wonderful non-regressive, aka progressive tax policy.
Just tax us. I scream this at the top of my lungs. I just do not understand why you don't hear that pushback more on the news. If you think this is regressive, it's not. If you think it's regressive and there's all these super rich people who are just getting this debt bonanza, tax them. Tax them. But at the same time that they're saying that, Joe Biden is out here, he was campaigning in 2020 on never raising taxes on anybody making under $400,000 a year. Yeah. So, I mean, to the extent that there might be the person who took out a bunch of debt and then had a bunch of debt and then made partner and suddenly makes $400,000 a year and for some reason didn't immediately pay off their debt, tax them. They're in that income bracket now. Tax the dickens out of them. But don't force the person to stay in the corporate law long enough to make partner for that reality to manifest. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I'm curious because I had never heard that the rationale for Elizabeth Warren to pick that $50,000 number was based on this idea that that was the maximum number to close the racial wealth gap. Because during the campaign, I was reading the stat that said if you had eliminated it all, it would take the racial wealth gap for Black families of a certain generational cohort from, shrunk it dramatically. I don't remember the exact number, but like 26-1 to 4-1 or something. Really mind-boggling. And it always struck me as very frustrating that because of the authority that Elizabeth Warren has with her CFPB background and the way that she really has a mastery of the wonkiness and is a really good communicator about a lot of these things, was able to dominate the narrative and put in many people's heads that you can only do 50,000. And I see people arguing in the threads, in my mentions every time I tweet about student debt cancellation. Well, you can only do so much. Joe Biden only has the authority to cancel so much. Like, that feels very noxious to me. Where did that come from? I see you shaking your head, Ashley. Like, what's the deal?
I mean, I think this $50,000 was, it just, what a nice round number, right? I mean,
somebody wrote a paper.
Somebody wrote a paper hitting that number, giving it a rationale. And, so Elizabeth Warren has been a really paradoxical figure in this because I think she's been a real obstacle because she has put this $50,000 limit on there. Now the rationale is totally out from under it. Sorry. It's like, if you believed your own arguments, you'd at least be pushing for 75. But she's done a lot of good by elevating the reality that the Biden administration, that any president already has the authority to cancel all federal student loans. So this is an authority already granted by Congress, first in the Higher Education Act of 1965. This is not some crazy workaround to get around the, obstructive elements in there. No, this is the Congress already said, hey, Secretary of Education, President, you have the authority to cancel this debt. And so that is something the Debt Collective has been pushing with Lou Caron, who's one of the co-founders of the Debt Collective, who now is a well-known, legal expert on this. And she was the first big figure to get behind this and really legitimize it precisely because of her power as the queen of policy.
Right.
So she's had this mixed role. The thing is clear, and what we've tried to say to Senator Schumer and other people in this space is always say at least $50,000 moving forward. Have that be your talking point. If we can't get you to get behind canceling it all because that's somehow Bernie's territory or the squad's territory, at least could you be intellectually honest and say President Biden should use the authority he possesses to cancel a minimum of $50,000 student debt. And we've seen them say that occasionally, but it's a misleading message that just confuses people. And that's a problem when there's so much purposeful confusion happening from all of these different parties.
What's the feedback? Do they say anything substantive about why they're unwilling to let go of the $50,000 number?
We've actually tried. So we've tried to set the team up with meetings, for example, with a fellow named Jaleel Bishop, who's an organizer with the Debt Collective and just did the biggest empirical study. It's called Jim Crow Debt. biggest empirical study of Black student borrowers, who is also just like, this is not an empirically or intellectually credible figure. And, it's just, I think it's something where they feel like they have just so much political capital invested in that. That they're committed to it.
It's so weird. And I will say, I don't, this is anecdotal, so feel free to like completely dismiss it. But my experience of people who have that like super crazy quarter, $500,000, $750,000 debt, and I have more than one friend like that, they're Black. I can't, maybe that's just because I have disproportionately Black friends. Like, I don't know what the deal is, but the people I know whose student debt amounts make me like gasp and have a heart palpitation just even thinking about it are people who come from working class families, whose families sign for all of these loans and who are as a whole debilitated by this amount of debt. The people in question either didn't graduate or went into a non-lucrative field that also didn't qualify for student debt forgiveness, like journalism. And they have like really strong principles about not wanting to do other things. And they just feel trapped. I mean, obviously that's a very small piece of the pie, and I would hate to derail. Like, if they were going to give us 50,000, like, I would take it and be thrilled because I know that would help the overwhelming majority of people. But there is something to me that's particularly unethical about pretending like there wasn't this bargain where you told especially Black people that everything that was wrong with Black people in America is because they didn't value education and they didn't go to school. And then all of these people went to the best school they could get into, because that was what we were all told. Go to the best school you got into. These people went to these expensive schools, many of which were, yes, elite Ivy League institutions, first in their family to ever go to a place like that, have all this debt, and then suddenly are being told that they somehow are lazy, didn't work hard enough, and didn't do the right thing. I find that to be ethically abhorrent.
Yeah. I mean, I know Marshall Steinbaum has talked about this a bit. He's kind of my main reference for it, but I'm fairly certain that there are, people try to address racism in the labor market by getting degrees, right? And this is something like you're saying that like is basically this is the individualistic approach that we have mandated to people. It's like, you can't get a job, you just go to graduate school, get another degree, right? Without any regard to the fact that like that is actually in a lot of cases the result of systemic institutional racism, is the result of people who are better connected getting those jobs, and like the solution to go and take on more debt and get more degrees because it's like education debt is like the housing market in 2005 or something, right? It's like it can't go down.
Yep.
So, and I think like also what you're getting at is there's just something extremely cruel when you're talking about these more or less arbitrary cutoffs of saying, well, okay, yes, we need to leave some Black people in a lot. Yes, student debt is a major racial justice issue. And so that's why we need to leave some Black people in debt in order not to help too many white people.
Also, I'm really happy to help white people. Like, I don't know why that is supposed to upset me.
Right.
I know that there are some people who that does upset, but I think that they should, talk to a professional about that. I want everybody who needs help to have help. The idea that a Fox News person, like, who is the audience where he's like, guys, don't do this program. It's going to help a white person. It's incredible. Like, it's kind of incredible.
But this is where I think Sparky, I mean, your story, anecdotally, I actually know a lot of people. The people I know who with over $500,000 of debt were, working class or grew up poor, Black people who went and were like, I'm going to go to medical school. This is how I'm going to help my community, and bury myself in $600,000 worth of debt, right? So and I think Sparky's point, like, right, that somehow to prove our racial justice bona fides, we're going to leave some Black people with debt and a whole bunch of white people. I mean, it's just, it's the lack of really taking stock of the fundamental morality of this issue and how we got here. This is where I think, again, the Debt Collective always says, we're not asking for forgiveness. We're demanding justice, because there's a whole policy and ideology that said, yes, you're poor, it's your fault, educate yourself out of it, right? And yeah, build your human capital and then, go and sell yourself on the open market. And it has not worked. I mean, we are seeing now a generation of people who are worse off, not just because they went to predatory for-profit colleges. That's what we were saying 5 years ago, but because they went to college at all.
Right.
And so I think like the public deserves an apology, right? And the government and these people who design these programs, who are in power right now, working in agencies like the Department of Education, the people who design these systems are still there. You know, we're so reluctant to admit their mistakes.
Right. It's one of them is president.
One of them is president. And like they should be, you know, asking for forgiveness. They're the ones who should be asking for forgiveness because this is a system that they designed. And we've had decades of these tweaks, right? Where they're like, well, now the repayment programs will work. And now PSLF, or public service loan forgiveness, that'll function just great. And now the servicers won't like call you and harass you, you know, and break the law. And it's just like, no, we're done with your fixes. We're done with your payment pauses. Like this was like a wrong turn on the way to the future. We need to just admit it. And like the solution is so fucking simple.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to do two things, right? I hate to, one, use the N-word, neoliberalism, to be like, look, you know, this was, the whole idea of the student debt system is, you know, we can, okay, you know, 1965, only people who can kind of afford to pay or are getting money from the military to go to college can go to college. We need to open this up to everybody because we think that everybody should be able to go to college. Oh, I have an idea. Why don't we do it in a way that will allow lenders to get really, really rich in the meantime, right? Like that was the choice that not we, but like that they made at that time. They said, we're going to select a policy. You know, we had a high school movement in the early 1900s that at that point, very few people went to high school. Most of them were white. Most of them were rich. And there was an entire movement, actually a grassroots movement throughout the country in order to create what we now have as the public high school system, which was a system that, like elementary school, is free for everyone to go to, funded through, you know, not a great mechanism in property taxes, but everybody can go for free. And nobody makes the argument of like, you know, you don't hear people out here going like, "Oh, I'm so mad that like Donald Trump's kids can go to high school for free or something."
Yeah,
right?
Or that I don't have kids and I'm still paying for your ability to send your kids to public school.
And it was the exact same situation for college, and they made a different choice. They decided, no, we need to, and remember, you know, the federal lending program is relatively recent. Originally, these were federal guarantees for private loans. This is the federal government guaranteeing that private lenders are going to get their money from people who they lend to go to college. So it's, you know, so many of these arguments, I feel like if people could just take, it's so naturalized now. It's so fast, right? A couple of decades, and this stuff seems as if it's the only way that things can possibly work. But this was it was an experimental choice of the era in the 1960s to say, like, we think we can do this as a private-public partnership. We think we can do it with loans. We think we can do it in a way that will help rich people make money on interest from poor people. And that's the system that we're living in. And just, you know, to the fact that it is no longer a private lending system, it is now a federal lending system. I can't see any way around really seeing this as a tax. And again, like to both your and Astra's points about the way that we have a progressive, you know, revenue collection or inflation control or whatever, like that is our tax system. That is the income tax. That's the way that we do that. All we're doing is we're saying, okay, if your parents can't pay up front for college when you go to college, that means you have to pay for that college plus interest to the federal government, essentially for the rest of your life, no matter what. And just zoom out for a second. There's no circumstance in which you would say, okay, the people who we need to put this financial burden on, whatever the importance of that is this set of people. Like, no, you would never, ever say that. But that's what we've ended up with. You know, if your parents were rich, then you go to college for free because they paid for it. And then you go and you get your high-paying job. And then, you know, you don't
you buy a brownstone in Park Slope like some of my peers.
And then you pay the same income tax. You pay the same income tax that everybody else does, except probably less because you have creative accountants. And here we are paying what your parents paid plus 8% interest for 30 years or something. It's just the most fucking ridiculous system that people take for granted, and they got to stop.
I want to put Sparky on Fox News and be like, it's an educational tax. Down taxes.
Well, I think that's really well put, Sparky. I mean, people say, I get people in my mentions all the time saying things like, you took out the debt, pay back your loans. And I've been trying to figure out the concrete number of how much I've paid so far over the last 10 years. Great Lakes makes it very difficult to find that particular number. But my recollection from the beginning of the process, where they sit you down right before you sign all the loan forms and say this is what it's going to be, and was that over the course of the 10-year payment program that I had opted for, the $180,000 loan was going to make me pay $250,000 back. And people say, pay back your debt. It's I'm pretty sure I've paid $180,000 at least at this point. The question is whether or not I should have to pay that other $70,000 of tax on top of it, just because that's the nature of what the interest was.
Well, it's also the issue that you shouldn't have to pay the $180,000 either.
Well, yes. But to the extent that people are making this, you didn't work hard, you didn't do, you went and got a master's in pottery. No, I did exactly what you wanted. I became an evil corporate lawyer.
I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember getting my my financial aid package when I went to college. This happened when I transferred from community college to a 4-year public school, right? You get your financial aid award package, and it's Pell Grant, maybe some school specific grant, and then, Stafford loan. And it's just a list of a list of things as if they're all the same. I don't know if they still do this, but that's how it was before. It was this is a financial aid award. I just can't imagine if I had even had the thought to be oh, well, fuck no, I'm not going to go to UCLA. If they're going to make me take out a loan. No, can you imagine the reaction that even my relatives who largely did not go to college, that would have been insane.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Of course not. You have to go.
It truly wasn't a thing. And I have one friend I know from college or from law school rather, who got into an Ivy League college, opted to go to the state school, and then ended up at Harvard Law with me. And I found that one example really interesting. And it's not, it happens sometimes. People do, for financial reasons. But she didn't do it for financial reasons. Her parents are rather affluent. They both went to Harvard as well. And her dad's a doctor and all this stuff. But it was almost the confidence that she was not going to be hurt by going to an excellent state school, but one which might not get her as much purchase in the employment market as a Harvard degree would, because she had all these other protections. And I remember thinking, I remember growing up thinking, oh, if I don't go to, the narrative was, if I don't go to college, I'm going to end up destitute in a box. That truly was what was going through my little 17-year-old mind. Not an elite college, but a college. I definitely had to go to a college. And it just boggles my mind. I'm sorry to be redundant, but the way that script got flipped so fast. And suddenly it's the most irresponsible thing to have done in the world, to actually just do exactly what I was told and what the whole society was telling me I was told. We've gotten a little far away from this video. I do want to watch a little bit more of it, if you'll just bear with me, because there are a couple of themes that we have yet to hit that I want them to put out on the table. And then I want to pivot to asking you, Astra, about next steps and what we're plotting for May 1st.
There's about $1.6 trillion in student loan, federal student loans. 50% of that is for graduate degrees. It's for master's degrees, it's PhDs, medical degrees, law degrees. So forgiving those loans is a massive wealth transfer from the working class to the educated elite. It's not progressive. It's not smart economics. It makes no sense, and we shouldn't do it.
So then how do you explain the progressive push for this? And I will just read you what AOC said after the moratorium was announced and pushed back till May. She said, "Thank you. Next step, cancellation." So if, as you say, this is not a progressive idea at all, why? Why are they so behind it?
It's a regressive idea. It's a regressive idea, and I have no idea why they're in favor of it. But also keep in mind, what about the people who were responsible? What about the people who didn't take on more college debt than they could afford? What about the people who saved for college or worked went to college part-time while working to pay off, or people who paid off their college loans? So the question you have to ask yourself is, should your neighbor have to pay for your college education? right?
Yep.
Why should your neighbor, and especially if you're an educated person, why should your working class neighbor, some of the people the tradespeople who come to your home and work on your home and provide you with these services, they should also be paying for your college education? Are we
All right,
crazy?
Ben. I think that's it.
You should be responsible and be born to rich parents. What about responsibly choosing some rich parents?
That's right.
Yeah, the idea that the people who have student loan debts aren't also the people who are like having work study jobs, like as a condition of our student aid. Like, of course we were working the whole time.
Or that trade schools are free, I guess. I don't know.
Right. I said this on another podcast, I think, but I had a boss who was a lawyer who was against student loan cancellation, who argued that he paid for, my light's about to go out. I'm sorry. It's now doing a little bit of a strobe light thing. But this is just what it is, because otherwise I'm just in darkness.
It's a student loan emergency. The light's flashing.
I think it's cool. It looks kind of moody. I dig it.
This is wild. Okay, look. My boss told me that he was unsympathetic to student loan borrowers because he worked for a summer at a gas station to pay off his law school debt. And I asked him which gas station I should sign up for that will pay me $60,000 for 2 months' work.
Mm-hmm.
How old is this guy?
Like a young boomer.
Oh, interesting. Because I did some research. I couldn't find how much our dear president had spent for his respective degrees. And what I could find seemed to tell me that he paid about $1,500 for his law degree. So that's gas stationable.
$1,500. That sounds nice. All right. So, do you have any other responses to that why should you pay for your neighbor kind of line of rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, really quickly, I feel like I'm repeating stuff maybe I said the last time I was on the podcast, but the individualization of this is so misleading, as though we don't benefit from having people who have college degrees who are able to become public school teachers, become the kinds of dentists and doctors we're talking about, working in rural areas where they're not trying to maximize their income, who are public defenders. I mean, this idea that we don't collectively benefit from having education extended beyond the K through 12, free scenario that we're accustomed to is just, that's part of what we need to push against, right? This is not really just about individual debtors and their choices, even though my position is it doesn't freaking matter what choices people made. The system's the problem. The fact is we would all benefit from a different system, and we'd benefit on multiple levels, including economically. So that is something I think we really need to push back against. His whole thing about wealth transfer and the data on debt is precisely the opposite. Debt is a wealth transfer from the poor, from borrowers to the rich. It accelerates, compounds wealth inequality. That's what this arrangement is doing. You're robbed once at the job, you're underpaid, you're forced to borrow to pay the gap. As the Debt Collective loves to say, you're not in debt because you live beyond your means, but because you're denied the means to live. And so then you get robbed twice because you are charged for the money that you're using to survive or to invest in your future. So, he's in this looking glass kind of parallel world where he's using these words and phrases, the working class, a wealth transfer, but it's for this completely distorting ideological agenda. I do just want to say to your point about not being able to figure out how much interest you've paid, Brie. The fact is there's not hard data on how much of that $1.8 trillion is interest.
Mm-hmm.
Why the fuck don't we know that, right? That should be part of the public debate, because the truth is a lot of it is, and that would, hasten a conversation that we're already having, which is, well, how much of this is even principal? How much of this is interest? The fact is a lot of people have already paid. They've paid what they borrowed to begin with. And so that is one of those things where the fact we don't know that's a number that should not be hard to come up with. Just shows how they want to keep this stuff veiled and obscure and confusing.
Yeah. I also I know that I say this a lot and I tweet it a lot, but I can't get past how openly craven people are willing to be when making the argument that they shouldn't care or want to provide for their neighbor. I mean, that has to be the least solidaristic, anti-American on some level way to approach the world. And it's remarkable to me that there haven't been any folks on the left who are willing to push back against conservative commentators who are using this line of reasoning that would get rid of our hospitals and our schools and our libraries and our public infrastructure and every other thing. And the choice rhetoric always strikes me in particular, as a childless woman of a certain age, as really, really interesting. Because the other thing that they say to Black people as to why we have all the problems in the world, as in addition to education, is like having children when you're not supposed to. And to see how this narrative gets flipped, like it's bad for some people to have children, but if someone like me doesn't have children in part because of feeling like I couldn't have the kind of life I'd like because of my student loan obligations, then I'm still expected to pay into all of these other pots, which I'm more than happy to do because we live in a society. But the parallels there just don't fly completely out of people's minds. And it really, I think, begs a bigger conversation about how there are winners and losers. People say that you're picking winners and losers. They're constantly picking winners and losers. And you're always the loser, working person. Stop fighting against your own interests. You are always the loser. And there are always tax breaks for buying $1 million house and writing off the mortgage and all of these other kinds of things, and the SALT tax and all of this stuff. And the one time there's potentially going to be a debt jubilee that directly impacts people who didn't have enough money to pay for college. A student debtor, fundamentally, definitionally, is someone who didn't have enough money to pay for college. That's the one you're going to argue against. That's the one that's going to suck up all of this national airtime. Choose your choices, people. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.